An election threat and testimony about alleged Chinese interference, challenging the No More Pipelines bill and the Prime Minister's supposed empty plane. Here to chat about all of this in more detail is political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley. Brian, great to have you on again.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we've had weeks of drama, a filibuster, an election threat, all over stopping Katie Telford, the Prime Minister's chief of staff, from testifying about alleged China's election interference. So Tuesday morning, that all stopped. So Brian, what changed?
Well, it seemed like everything changed in the matter of an hour or so, Jeanette. On Monday, we're in high drama. It wasn't just, one or two media outlets reporting, hey, the Liberals are threatening an election if Katie Telford's forced to testify. It was everybody. That's how they took what the Liberals were saying. They were asked, is this going to be a confidence vote? The Conservatives had a motion calling for Telford to testify. That was going to be voted on Tuesday afternoon, and the Liberals could make it a confidence motion. And that means if the motion passed, which means the government loses, then we could be headed for an election. Suddenly, the Prime Minister comes out and makes an announcement and says on his way into cabinet, this is not going to be a confidence vote. And then he says, and by the way, David Johnson's mandate will be out later today. And then while he's in cabinet, a news release comes out saying Katie Telford will testify. And it comes from the Prime Minister's office. So they've been blocking his chief of staff from answering questions about what she knew, what she told the Prime Minister about allegations of China's election interference. They've been blocking this for weeks. The procedure in House Affairs Committee, the House of Commons, has barely been able to do anything else because the Liberals just keep trying to block the vote by talking as long as they can. As long as they keep talking, there's no vote. Then just say, Madam Chair, we have another point to raise. Let's talk about this. And then they talk for 20 minutes and then somebody else does. They've been embarrassing themselves. They've been making themselves look guilty. And then suddenly the Prime Minister's office says Telford will testify. I don't know why they went to these lengths when even the Toronto Star was saying, looks like you got something to hide when you're doing this. The Liberals are in bad shape, but that's where they were. And so, after weeks of filibustering, weeks of delay, they're going to let her testify. There's no election threat anymore. And it looks like we'll just proceed towards finding out about a public inquiry at a later date. But a lot of high drama for nothing. I mean, the balloon was deflated early in the morning by the Prime Minister making a couple of decisions he could have easily made weeks ago.
Wow, lots and lots of drama. Okay, but Brian, when the Liberals were still trying to stop Telford from testifying, they claimed that having her appear would be unprecedented. But you actually investigated the matter and found several chiefs of staff have testified in the past. So why are they claiming that it's unprecedented now?
It's utterly bizarre. They just kept saying, well, Pierre Poilievre opposed political staffers testifying in 2010, and so Telford can't testify. They made it sound like it was the end of democracy. But of course, she testified in July 2020 into the We Charity scandal. She testified in April of 2021 into allegations about sexual misconduct in the military. And I quoted her right off the top of one of my columns. I quoted her, and I can't give you the exact quotes, not in front of me, but it was to the effect of, thank you for having me here today. I look forward to answering all your questions. There was none of this drama. But, the position of chief of staff only goes back to the Mulroney era in 87. And I counted Norman Spector, who was one of Mulroney's chiefs of staff. He testified. Three of Harper's chiefs of staff. He had four, but three of the four of them testified. And as I said, Telford twice. This is not unusual. But they obviously wanted to stop her from speaking on this issue. And I'll try and explain why briefly, Jeanette. The belief is that Telford is the one that CSIS went to in September 2019 when they had concerns about a then Liberal candidate and now Liberal MP. It's been identified by some media as Han Dong. He's the Liberal MP for Don Valley North. So Trudeau's never denied that CSIS came to him. He said things like it's racist to ask questions, CSIS doesn't get to choose. He's never denied that CSIS gave his party a briefing. It's believed that Telford took that briefing. And so what MPs want to know from all the opposition parties is, well, what did they tell you? What did you tell the Prime Minister? What did you do about it? because if CSIS is warning you that you've got a candidate who is compromised, you might want to say, okay, well, this person shouldn't run for us. Instead, they never did that. And in fact, they hid all of what they were told. This has not shown up in any of the public reports that we have. So I think they were worried about that information coming out and perhaps more. And that's why they've been so adamant that she not appear and making it sound like this has never happened before when clearly it has.
Wow, so much to uncover there. Okay, so Brian, David Johnston was announced as Trudeau's special rapporteur last week, and his mandate is now out. So when he was announced, you said that he's a man of integrity, but the wrong choice. So why did you say that?
Well, look, I thought David Johnston was a fine Governor General, and I'd met him prior to him being appointed. He actually did a similar job for Stephen Harper when Brian Mulroney was facing allegations from Karl-Heinz Schreiber, and Stephen Harper called the Airbus Inquirer, or the Oliphant Commission as it became known. David Johnston was chosen to say, okay, you decide on the terms of reference. But David Johnston and Stephen Harper weren't longtime friends. They didn't have a history. You can't say that with Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau has called him a family friend. Johnston has talked about how he's known Justin since Justin Trudeau was 6 years old, that the Johnston families and the Trudeau families would go skiing together north of Montreal. This is a real Laurentian elite, cozy club, Jeanette. They didn't look far beyond a very cozy circle. And look, I think Johnston is a man of integrity, but there's a few problems there. You're that close to the Prime Minister. Can you be objective? And even if you can, will people believe that you're objective? I think that is something that is of concern. If he doesn't come out with a recommendation for a strong public inquiry, how many people are going to say, well, there's those Laurentian elite buddies looking after each other again. There's the Ottawa club constantly looking after its own. So that's part of the problem. The other problem is, he doesn't know the ins and outs of ground level politics, which is what this is all about. Nomination meetings and how do you stack them and how do you influence them? He's an academic. He doesn't know this world. So that's one of the other problems that that many have pointed out about this guy.
That's interesting. Okay, Brian, last week it was a claim of election interference in Vancouver, and today Ontario Premier Doug Ford answered questions about CSIS briefing his government. So Ford said that he didn't find out much from CSIS. So Brian, what can you tell us?
So the Ford government says we didn't know anything about the MPP that news reports allege was part of this foreign interference network. By the way, the man's named Vincent Ke. He represents the same riding, but provincially, as the gentleman I just mentioned earlier. So the same riding, federal and provincial representatives, different parties. The allegation is they were both part of this election interference network. Mr. Ke denies all allegations against him. The Ford government's response is, nobody told us. We found out from the media. We found out when a reporter started calling and emailing and asking questions. And then once the report came out, they went to CSIS and they said, well, what can you tell us? You haven't told us anything. I remember when the report came out, the MPP in question, when this broke in November, they didn't name the MPP, but I said, I'm betting it's this man. And I went and I asked him and he denied everything at the time. So I called the contact in the Ford government. Well, he's no longer the chief of staff, so I'll say it was the Premier's chief of staff, Jamie Wallace. And I said, were you briefed on any of this? They said no. Later on, they got CSIS to give them a briefing. Ford, when he was answering questions, said, they didn't tell us much. He said, with CSIS, everything's a secret. Maybe that's true, but I have two issues here. One, CSIS should have gone to the provincial government beforehand. And when I've said before that this is going to hit across the country and all levels of government, if I was Danielle Smith, if I was Dave Abbey, if I was Heather Stephenson or Scott Moe, I'd be calling up CSIS and saying, what do I need to be worried about? Because it turns out they're not alerting provincial governments when they have concerns, and they should be. Secondly, after Ford did find out, he should have acted. This gentleman was given a role of parliamentary assistant, so he's helping a cabinet minister with a cabinet file. that means they're close to information. He should have stepped aside from that and stepped aside from caucus immediately. Not because he's guilty. We don't know if any of these allegations are true, if any of these people are guilty, but you need to protect yourself. You need to protect the integrity of the thing. So CSIS should have warned the provincial government earlier here in Ontario, and Premier Ford should have acted sooner.
Okay. Brian, switching gears here, another group has announced that they're joining the Supreme Court challenge against Bill 69, which is also known as the No More Pipelines Bill. And that's the one that the Alberta Appeals Court struck down last year, right? So would you say that there's a growing pushback against this bill?
There is, and because of the way that the Trudeau government is dealing with the bill, trying to enact the bill, because even though the Alberta court struck it down, it's still, it is in. They said it's unconstitutional. It's still being applied, and there was an announcement today about a housing project in Ontario, but they want to use this same bill to say, well, can that go ahead? Next door to you in Saskatchewan, there's power plants that Premier Moe wants to build. Saskatchewan is embracing wind and solar to a degree, but Premier Moe said a little while ago, we still need natural gas plants for baseload power for when the sun's not shining and when the wind's not blowing. And the federal government is saying, oh, well, I don't know if you can do that. So they've taken this bill C-69, and they've expanded its scope into every area of, if the environment can touch on it, the federal government wants to regulate it. And that would essentially remove provincial power over everything. So it's not just pipelines for Alberta, it's housing development for Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario and everywhere else. It's how your electricity grid is going to be built. Alberta still uses a lot of coal. Are they going to try and force you out of coal? Well, look, everyone does want to move away from coal to other sources of electricity, but how that will be done, is it going to be dictated by the federal government? So now you've got all 10 provinces signing on. Well, I guess Alberta challenged it and won, but all 9 other provinces have signed on and said, we're backing Alberta. Think about that. That includes the NDP government in British Columbia. That includes the Liberal government in Newfoundland and Labrador. And now the Canadian Constitution Foundation is taking up the challenge as well, and they've hired lawyers to intervene. So we're expecting the case to come before the Supreme Court in the coming months, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. And, for me anyway, it may sound dry, but think about it. The federal government is trying to overtake pretty much every area of provincial and even municipal jurisdiction using an environmental assessment law. That is a bridge too far, as the Alberta Appeal Court said last year.
Yeah, it's such a huge issue, especially out here in the West, definitely. Okay, let's jump back onto the Prime Minister for a second here. So Justin Trudeau is someone who likes to preach about lowering your carbon footprint. Yet a new analysis is showing Trudeau's plane is often flying around empty. So how did this analysis come about, and how does this jive with his environmental claims?
Well, it's a former colleague of mine, Brian Pasfium, is with National Post now. He used to be with Toronto Sun, Calgary Sun. He's worked across the country, and he is an aviation junkie. He's one of these guys that plane watches. You've heard of train spotters and all of that. This guy watches the plane sites. And so often when you hear media talking about where Trudeau's taken off from or going to, it's because Brian Pasfium is tracking his plane. And he started noticing odd patterns. And I'll give you one example. Last week, the Prime Minister he landed in Toronto, and rather than have him drive back, they flew the plane empty from Toronto to Kitchener to save the Prime Minister an hour's car ride. So the plane flying empty to save the Prime Minister driving time. But what's the carbon footprint of that? Well, for his jet, it's a lot bigger than for his SUV. So it doesn't jive with it at all. But with Justin Trudeau, it's about optics. It's not about reality. Is he telling you the right thing, Jeanette? You shouldn't take that cheap flight to Vegas. You shouldn't go on a vacation. You should stay home. Don't drive anywhere. Walk for your vacation. But him, he's going to fly all over. And oftentimes, and you can see the full details in Brian's report, it is an empty plane. Not all the time, but more than you would think and more than is healthy, especially when you preach the way the Prime Minister does.
Brian, thanks so much. It looks like we're out of time, but it's so great to have you on once again.
Thank you for having me.